Jabari Mahiri here today, and Jabari is at the School of Education at Berkeley, and he's the author of a number of books that have been looking at issues of urban education, edited collection called What They Don't Learn in School, Literacy in the Lives of Urban Youth, and his own book on African American and youth culture in new century schools. I'm also really pleased that, particularly in really challenging urban contexts, and I think a lot of us who are working in this area, we've always had very good intentions about trying to adapt what we've been doing to make a difference in the lives of kids who may not otherwise have access to them, but very few of us do the hard work of actually trying to make that happen, both on the ground and at the intellectual and conceptual and curriculum level. So, we're really, this is, new work that's being written up right now, so we're really lucky to have an early peek into some of what Jabari's working on. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Mimi, and I'm really happy to be here and have an opportunity to present this work in its emerging phases. I look forward to our conversation during lunch to get feedback and ideas about some of the things that we're doing, and also to hear more of what you guys are doing too. Talking about multiliteracies in urban schools, we have this dilemma of teachers not really having resources and guidance on how they can transform their practice to accommodate some of the new literacies, the multiliteracies that are enabled by new digital media. So a key question for our research was to think about what were the most viable ways for teachers to learn to mediate student learning with appropriate digital technologies. And we have been engaged in this 18-month long study. It's actually a little bit longer than that now. A university school collaboration between me and several of my graduate students and this continuation high school in Northern California. We're kind of building this presentation from, this intervention from 6 years of work that we were doing with the main high school that actually feeds this continuation high school, feeds it in the sense of giving it the students that it doesn't want to deal with. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But one of the things that made me excited about doing this work, I was the PI on this other 6-year intervention that we had, and there's a book I'll call Unfinished Business that sort of documents what we did with the main high school in every aspect: teacher professional development and student voice and parent issues, working with a lot of research and statistics to sort of reflect back to the school what they were doing well and what was problematic, essentially, particularly the tracking program, just sort of giving them research to show that the tracking systems really weren't working as they were intended. And that whole, if there was an outcome to it, it was this large comprehensive high school breaking itself up into about 9 smaller high schools, so it was a part of a small schools movement. But what made us excited about this particular context was, one, there was a principal there, and you'll get to see him in a short video clip later, who had been a leader of instructional technology on the East Coast before coming here, Latino gentleman, about 40 years old. And he really had a good vision, on the one hand, for what was possible in this setting, which heretofore had just been really a dumping ground. And you'll see some statistics about the kind of students who end up coming to the school. And because he had this vision and wanted to see more technology being integrated into the teaching and learning at the school, the most important thing he did was gave 90-minute professional development session time twice a month for the entire school year. And so the idea then of having enough time to really get involved with teachers learning and then following and supporting teachers in terms of their engaging in that learning and trying to facilitate students learning through what they were learning in the professional development sessions was one of the things that made this very inspirational for us. And thinking about the kinds of things that teachers need to know, I'm going to make a point about disciplinary knowledge in relationship to all of these new media that exist, that the most important thing is the disciplinary knowledge that the teachers have. They also need to have cultural knowledge and an understanding of the cultural logics and perspectives that motivate behavior and ways of interacting, discourse patterns when young people come to school. And of course, technical knowledge, which they don't get a lot of background and experience in, except when they do, is usually a standalone program of some kind where they take a class on technology and instruction, but it's not really integrated. And I think that all of these areas of knowledge get funneled into what the teacher's pedagogical knowledge and practices are, and that's what we're interested in working with, attempting to change. We see that traditional structures of teaching and learning really haven't changed much in about 200 years. And our question is, what are the needed tools and techniques for teaching in the 21st century? I sometimes tell the story of a song that I used to enjoy listening to by James Taylor called The Frozen Man. And in the story of The Frozen Man, there's some fisherman who falls off a ship, an English fisherman. It's about 100 years ago. And he's immediately frozen into a block of ice. And so the rest of the song is about him being found and, medical technology bringing him back to life in contemporary times. And I just was imagining the frozen man going to an airport, or the frozen man going to a hospital, or the frozen man going to, almost any business, and being overwhelmed by the level of technology and other kinds of tools and machines and things that were in those spaces. And then we imagine the frozen man going to a school and thinking about the structure and culture of teaching and learning, in many schools. And I think he would find himself very comfortable walking into that space because not much has changed. And so that was our dilemma. I mean, we're not really doing anything new. Dewey talked about the notion of the importance of building on the experience of young people, but what happens when these experiences have dramatically changed, when young people are engaging in an attention economy, a social networked economy, a gift economy. So it's essentially suggesting that learners who have grown up digital have a very different approach to learning, and the result is that many students come to school with experiences and knowledge, different resources for making meaning, essentially new literacies that are enabled by the new technologies. These are my digital kids. The two older girls are actually twins, even though they don't look anything alike. This is maybe 3 or 4 years ago. They're 14 now. But what I was interested in this picture was my granddaughter, who's sitting on the side, and she's opened up a CD cover so that the CD cover is exactly for her like a little computer, and she's mimicking what they're doing on the computer. So this notion then that we're working with young people who acquire these perspectives and dispositions and skills and interactional capabilities with digital media, whereas as adults, and this is one of the sort of conflicts, we are more like learners, right? So we're more like the immigrants into this place where these people are digital native. At one point, my daughter just asked me, said, "Dad, what was life like before the internet?" I mean, her entire life had been contextualized by the internet, and her sense of how you get information, what the occasion for that particular point was, we decided that we were going to go to Puerto Rico for normally on spring break, I take my two daughters somewhere. This time it was Puerto Rico, and they immediately got on the internet. And before I knew it, they were like getting the hotel, they were making arrangements for other kinds of things, and I started saying, well, let's keep it like about a $200 limit on what the cost was going to be. But they essentially set that entire vacation up, and she was just like, how did you guys work before there was an internet? So there are a number of ways to think about conceptually what is happening with the new literacies and the kinds of things that are going on in the digital media that are enabling them. I borrow a few principles of new learning from the very end of James G's book, What Computers Can Teach Us About Teaching and Learning. At the end, he had 36 principles of new learning. And the ones that I like to work with teachers are the text principle, the multimodal principle, the material intelligence principle, the symbiotic domain principle, and the probing principle. And you guys are familiar, I'm sure, with a lot of this, but basically we're trying to have teachers begin to think differently about what a text is and how do you engage a text that may be multimodal, and having some conceptual frameworks for thinking then if it is multimodal, then the meaning making is occurring in a kind of symbiotic domain where multiple science systems are working simultaneously and collaboratively to make the meaning, so that the modes of music and visual text as well as written text and other kind of animated text may all be happening simultaneously in these new ways that young people are learning, as we said before, relatively naturally, and that we as teachers have to sort of catch up and understand how and what that's going on. The material intelligence principle, I'm not going to define each one of those, is interesting though, because it helps people, I think the teachers, see a couple of things. One, that they have to understand the way the media is designed. What has been designed into the media in terms of the kinds of affordances that transform the way we engage that medium, right? And one of the things that I talk about a little bit in the book is the concept of a third participant when we're talking about teachers and the notion of a zone of proximal development and the ways that teachers try to work as mediators to move novice learners to more expert skills and understandings. We also have now imposed into that zone this third participant of the material intelligence of the digital devices, and that teachers have to be aware of the roles that can play. I like to think that the cell phone is a contemporary model for a lot of the multimodal capabilities of new media, where you can have voice, written text, pictures, video, TV, audio, and recordings, music and other kinds of sounds, games, internet access, GPS, et cetera, all embedded in this increasingly smaller digital device. So kids are, growing up with cell phones, and we are struggling to understand, in the case of Paul Miller, who wrote the book Rhythm Science. He said that home is where your cell phone is, right? And many of us, realize that we walk out of our house and leave our cell phones, we do feel lost, right? We do feel that we basically have to go back and get it because we can't go further. So this collaboration was called TEACH, Technology, Equity, and Culture High School, between the university and this continuation high school. A couple people who work with it hate the name. I want to talk a little bit about these students though, because they basically have been cast out of the main high school. And where in the main high school, you have a demography of about 30% white, 30% African American, 17% Latino, and 8% Asian, and 15% multiracial. In this setting, it's 85% African American, 15% Latino, 65% male, 100% qualify for free lunch, 30% qualify for special ed. One of the good parts about this particular context, though, is that it's still very small. It has a very tidy campus with about 9 or 10 classrooms. It's about 8 or 9 blocks away from the main high school. And so and they only allow a maximum of 150 students per year. So it's at a scale that I think, and only about 10 teachers. So it was at a scale that we felt we could have more of an impact working with than the larger school, which had 3,500 students and hundreds of teachers. So these students get here in 2 ways. Either they have severe discipline problems, as even things like hitting a teacher or something like that, or they have severe underachievement problems on the academic side. including attendance or even a lack of attendance, where they just don't come to school. Part of the problem, though, and the reason I said on the other slide that they sort of profile, is that the school uses the continuation high school essentially as a dumping ground to remove students that they just don't want to deal with. So sometimes even when students are strong achievers, if they're acting in a certain way, teachers will be saying, you know, that looks like a B-Tech student. That looks like a student who belongs in the other school and not over here. And so I just want to give you about 10 seconds of the kind of situations that bring our students to the school.
I saw a girl that I knew about to get into a fight. Here comes you talking about all this stuff at one time that I can't get, just that all equals out, just I'm not supposed to be here, when I know that I've already made the decision that I'm going to calm her down, make sure she doesn't get into any trouble, especially in the fight. Finally, you put your hands on me. That was the first mistake you had. Second, you not put your hands on me, but you put your hands on me in a way that was threatening. It should have been dealt with in another manner, but because I was in school, and under quote-unquote school rules, I'm not supposed to do something. So I had to put down my own values, which is if a man touches me and that man are going to have it out.
So the situations are very intense, and this particular student didn't actually come to the school. This is a clip from School Colors back in 1994, but it was at the main high school where our students come from. So these structures of inequality, the expectations that teachers have of many students, but some students in particular, and there's a great book by Ronan Weinstein on Reaching Higher that really addresses the problems of just expectations alone. The discipline issue, which was characterized a little bit in that clip, and Pedro Noguera, who was the first PI in the diversity project work that was going on with the main high school, has a new book out in 2007 called The Trouble with Black Boys. Essentially making the case that we need to maybe look at African American males in schooling as kind of the canaries in the mine shaft. The extent to which they're doing well or not doing well is also an indication of what the health of the larger system is. The phenomenal book, Tracking by Jeannie Oakes, has been updated to special ed considerations, that the labeling and how people get designated. And this is what's sort of interesting. You're going to see some work by these students, and the principal is going to talk about which ones of those students have been designated as special ed. You would not know from the work that they're doing with these digital media that any kind of designation of special ed would necessarily attend to them. Socioeconomic structures and limitations, the vacuousness of the curriculum itself. And the special ed cartoon is just kind of funny. Kid is questioning, maybe I'm not the one with the disability, maybe you have a disability in teaching. And that's essentially what we're trying to focus on. Are teachers not able to really address, the needs of contemporary youth when they're coming to school with these experiences in a variety of media? We often talk about it as a movement from page to screen, and coming into schools and feeling like I have to power down, right? Because the tone and the structure of teaching and learning is so different from the ways that they're used to engaging in activities and making meaning in other aspects of their lives. So even at this continuation high school with a small staff, and one of the things that the principal had been good at doing was getting younger teachers, and many of them teachers of color, to come to the school. These are just pictures off of Google Images, so this is not the actual person who said this, but she does look a little bit like her. A younger, African-American woman who had just gotten her credential from UC Berkeley. And so here's one of our premier institutions, and yet when she goes into her actual practice, she talks about how she completely resists the idea of integrating technology into her practice. She feels that her own limited proficiency and fears of trying to teach students who may know more about the technology than she does, or that she just doesn't understand certain things, particularly how to effectively use the technology appropriately for learning inside the classroom. That was our challenge in this particular setting. Kids are way ahead of us as adults in many cases in using some of these mediums. So the first several sessions in 2007 in the fall when we began, we spent some time during the summer working with the principal and some of the teachers and our graduate students, trying to design and plan what would be happening for the year, even though we knew that there may need to be some things that changed. And one of the things that we thought we needed to do was at least have some experiences with working with some sense of what are effective standards or principles for instruction. So we borrowed from an organization called CREED, which is here in the Bay Area, in the Bay Area, where am I? Which is here, in Southern California. We're actually down at, started in San Diego, at the University of San Diego. But the Center for Research and Education and Diversity and Excellence has developed an entire way of thinking about effectively engaging in teaching and learning. And one of the things that's not on the slide, though, is that all of these principles, they feel are best mediated through a concept of activity centers. And we like that notion of activity centers because the most fundamental thing that we saw needing to change was that actual structure of the classroom. How do you create situations in the classroom where there's less teacher talk and more student talk, that people are doing project-based learning in activity centers rather than the sort of stand and deliver kinds of orientations that still have a lot of use in contemporary schooling. The other thing that we were interested in doing is not inventing wheels that already were in existence. There were a number of organizations that were doing very effective things with young people around digital mediation of this and that. I personally had some experiences and work with a lot of people at Youth Radio, which is in Oakland. It started in Berkeley, and now they have a new site right in downtown Oakland. And what Youth Radio had been doing, I mean, almost any time you hear something on NPR that's a youth commentary or podcast, the tagline for that is some young person from Youth Radio. And it's not just those kinds of things. That when you go to their new facility, it is like probably the most state-of-the-art digital media facility anywhere in Oakland right now. And they've done some things in terms of the way they've worked with young people, jointly framing projects, facilitating young people taking the lead in an inquiry, a notion of distributed accountability where everybody working on a project has different roles that they're playing, and students and young people understanding how all of these things combine together to create whatever the final project was. But all of these ideas go against some of the ways we traditionally think about teaching and learning in classrooms with the individual focus on one person's learning and ideas. So over the course of the year, through our professional development sessions, we worked with the teachers on, and what we tried to do was design the professional development sessions in ways that they could experience a digital medium similar to how the students might actually be experiencing it in the context of teaching and learning in the classroom. So we worked on blogs, on podcasting, on and youth commentaries, on digital stories, on digital arts and photography, on web searching, on Google applications like Google Maps, Google Images, Google Earth, Google Documents, and Second Life. And so what I want to do is talk just about two of those things that carried over into the classroom. There were teachers who, it was uneven. Some teachers were really pressing forward on almost all of these things over the course of the year and experimenting with them. The way that we would do it is we would work on something in a professional development session, learning together how to use it. the Digital Youth Project really helped us out in this, in that they gave us some additional funding that actually covered us being able to hire a technology expert to lead some of these sections on the technology portions of it. And he was absolutely critical to the effectiveness of all of us learning about some of these media. But we wanted the teachers to have almost a completely low stakes way of playing with some of these things in their classroom, so they would never be assigned to do something and come back and report it back. But they were encouraged to play with one medium or another in their classrooms, and then a part of the next session, they would come back and just talk about what had happened with the other teachers. So this notion of teachers teaching teachers was where we were trying to go with that. We wanted to step further and further back from our role of guiding, the direction of the learning to just supporting it. And the support also came with us going into the classrooms. We'd have graduate students when a teacher was going to try something out. They would work with a graduate student, and the graduate student would be in the classroom also, just to, because there would be all kind of technical glitches and things like that. The principal had been good about getting into this school a mobile computer lab. And it had about 10 Mac iBooks on it, and so they could cart them around to the different classrooms. But midway through the year, there was a theft at the school, and the computers were stolen. At the same time, the principal was beginning to think that what we needed really more was a solid computer lab, because there were a lot of other things that needed to happen. It needed to have some, hardwire connections and things like that. We needed more powerful machines. And so it was at the same time that he was planning to put the other computer lab into place, and I just fast forwarded that, so that the transition from some of those things happening in individual classrooms to teachers bringing their classes to the designated space that had become the computer lab, was part of what was going on in terms of just dealing with occurrences that came up as we went through this session. So, I'm not going to try. This is not for you to read or anything like that, but I just have just the titles. A couple just highlights. The kids were always pushing both us as the researchers and leaders of the instruction and the teachers, so that when they would, what the teachers found is if they tried something like a blog, the kids would take it to a much higher level, not only than the teachers were capable of dealing with, but that they didn't even imagine some of the applications that the young people would do with these things. And there's one case, this kid called his blogging the Worldwide Wall, because it was sort of like his notion of like graffiti. He had just lost a friend, and over the course of the year, and this is another interesting thing, and why we were able to work in this school somewhat successfully. Here these kids are here because of these disciplinary issues, but the culture of the school had been transformed by the principal to the extent that in that entire year, kids who were there for fighting and for discipline problems, there was not one fight on the campus in the entire year. There was one fight a couple blocks from the campus where some girls from the main high school came down and jumped on one of our girls, right? But so there was this transformation of the culture, but the kids themselves would say, okay, we know you guys are in our corner. We know you guys have our best interests at heart, but still, what's different about learning here than what we were doing at the other high school? So they were raising the challenge that it was not enough to just be caring adults and have the best interests of these students at heart, that the transformation of what they were actually doing on a day-to-day basis, they shouldn't have to wait through 6 hours of school to get to a youth radio or a youth speaks or a youth together or a youth first kind of organization to have these kind of vital, vibrant experiences, right? And so part of our challenge was that what is it about the culture and structure of schooling that can be changed to allow or admit more of these kinds of experiences to take place inside of school? So this particular person actually, so that even though there was no violence on our campus, these kids their lives were contextualized by violence. And in this particular case, over the course of the year, there were 3 young people in other places who had been killed that our students knew about in drive-bys or wherever. And this particular young man's friend had been killed. And part of what he wanted to use his blog to do was to be a tribute to this fallen friend, And he wanted to have a slideshow on the blog also. But nobody knew how to put a slideshow on the blog. And he figured it out, on his own. I mean, he kept working with it. And when he did, it was a moment in class. I was there at the time. I mean, his excitement was, it made it officially cool in the entire classroom for kids to sort of be doing this and to be working with it. So there are a zillion stories, and I get to tell some of these in the book. The podcasting, as they talk about their lives, you see this context of violence where a kid has created a podcast about himself being a victim of post-traumatic stress syndrome, like, violent experiences, right? And one of the things that we were able to see when we reverse the history of how these kids came to the school is that in almost every case, something traumatic had occurred in their lives at middle school or even later that was also collateral to their performance in school, going completely down the tube. So that it wasn't that they were, habitually bad students, but just struggling with the kinds of conditions that they were growing up in. School did not, become their most important priority. And part of what we're trying to do is see, could through some of these techniques, I'm not going to try to go into each one of these stories, but there are a million stories to be told. In the case of, and one of the things I think that was interesting is that teachers sometimes feel we have to give up old literacies in order to engage the new literacies. And a lot of what we saw the teachers imaginatively being able to do in the case of this work that was going on with digital photography was to blend old literacies and new literacies. So in this particular case, they were working with digital photography. They were learning how to crop and edit and source a variety of images from resources on the web. But the structure of it was to create a magazine where each student was going to have one article in this digital magazine, so that they did the artwork for it on the one hand, but they also wrote the article too and posted that online. So this notion then that you don't necessarily, you're not giving up something, but it's additive, was part of what was going on. And just the idea that so many comments that the kids had in one of our surveys about how they had learned to love to do research online, all right? So the two things that I want to share with you that we will go just a little bit deeper into is one of the things that the math teacher did, and I'm calling it trigonometry on Google Earth. And this is why I think the disciplinary background and knowledge was so important, because we all learned about Google Earth, but no one saw an application like this that the geometry teacher figured out. And essentially, I'll just sort of give you a quick overview, and then I'm going to show you a 2-minute clip. As the young people, one, it was all of the kinds of things we were talking about before in terms of sourcing background and experiences we use, making it culturally relevant. He figured out that the kids got excited just by playing with Google Earth. They wanted to go to their house, they wanted to go to their friend's house, they wanted to go to the mall on Google Earth, right, all these virtual spaces. And so the excitement level was there, and then he sort of took that after allowing them to learn about it and play with it and turned it back to what they were learning at that point in their class, which was the fundamental functions of trigonometry, which essentially, are based on the sine and the cosine and the tangent functions, and then everything sort of elaborates from there. In this particular case, he was reinforcing their learning about the tangent function by showing them that if they took this little blue gun that you see here, which is an altimeter, and you aim it at something, whatever it is, at the height of it, when you pull the trigger, it gives you the angle that is from where you're standing to that particular height. Then they will go back into the lab and use Google Earth to calculate, the coordinates between the two spaces, wherever you were standing, or whether it was maybe you were at the school and you were doing a campanile, or you were looking across at the Transamerica building. You would be able to get the distance so that, with this particular tangent function, anytime you have the angle and one of the sides, then you can calculate the other side. So they were calculating the height of all of these prominent things in their environment that they could see from their campus using Google Earth. So they just... just didn't like it. Didn't see any utility for it. Didn't see any reason to be learning all of these formulas. But these kids are actively engaged, and one of the things the teacher said is that when they did have a exit exam and a couple other tests, some of the students who've been able to experience this part of it really did remember those formulas. It was like a real way of making the learning relevant, for these young people. So again, in addition to the other things that we had done, I just want to have a little bit of a tour with you of some of the things that we also did with one of the classes in Second Life. There were actually two explorations into teen Second Life. I, through my research funds, bought the island for our school, and we named it Tech Island or something like that. And we had the island for a year. The first incursion was one of my graduate students did a dissertation. She did the research that's evolving into a dissertation where she was trying to teach certain kind of math functions. So this was a standalone piece. Fractals and other kinds of things that are tied to the way the kids are able to operate and work with shapes. She was trying to see ways that they could learn both a kind of computational literacy on the one hand and some of the some mathematical functions on the other. And this was like about a 3-week intervention. But toward the very end of the school year, we also went into Teen Second Life with one of the classes, and believe it or not, it was the teacher who at the very beginning of the year was talking about being technophobic, who now felt comfortable guiding her students on this 3-week unit that was going on in Second Life. So of course they built their avatars, had a lot of fun, with all the kinds of identity connections and things like that that go on when you're playing in Second Life. I understand that we're broadcasting in Second Life now. I want to just show some of the part when we went in toward the end of the year. We were interested in the ways that students could not so much go into something like learning math, although that was important. The geometry implications are obvious. But we were interested in just the kinds of things that they would discover and get excited about doing when they had the opportunity to essentially play in this virtual space. What kinds of things would they create? What kinds of identities would they enact? What kinds of learning experiences, what kind of learning would they feel that they were having as a result of, sort of playing in this digital game-like environment that's different from many of the kind of video games that they were used to. And so they built a number of things that, were of interest, where part of what was going on is, again, they had to discover or probe the digital environment to figure out things that they wanted to do that weren't necessarily in some of the instruction menus and things like that. This particular kid just wanted to build a tunnel that would go from our island all the way over to the mainland. He never quite got there, but what he had to do, the principal talks about it, he had to figure out something that was not available in any of the directions in order to continue to link the different aspects of the tunnel together. So I wanted to just show you a quick clip of the kids coming up to UC Berkeley to talk about their work to a group of graduate students and professors. And part of what it is, you're not going to see much activity, although I have clips of more of them actually showing it. I'm just interested in the difference in their positionality as learners and feeling like we are the experts here, that we know something that professors and graduate students at UC Berkeley would be interested in through the work that we've been doing in our class. So
It's still like moving around. It's Yeah, basically. There's mushrooms in the backyard. And yeah, basically that's my house. Just and around it.
Videos out on education in Second Life and the kinds of things that can be done in terms of this 3D environment. But again, in this particular unit, the teacher had some dedicated goals for learning, but also she allowed for a lot of just playing with the apparatus, playing with the media, and figuring out things and going to different places. The notion of sort of being world travelers, right? That these kids could go. Some of them have never been to San Francisco, believe it or not. They live in Oakland, and they've never been to San Francisco. But now they've been able to go to the Eiffel Tower in France and go up the elevator in the Eiffel Tower and jump off with the parachute that you can purchase at the top with Linden dollars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that was significant, and I'm not going to try to make a case that our intervention is responsible for this, but the evolution of this school with students getting re-engaged in learning and returned on to learning was interesting from the standpoint that the API scores, which are done at the end of the year, at the end of the 2007-2008 school year, the API scores had jumped over 150 points. And they had gone from 400 and something to 587. And even, 800 is the base that we're trying to get all schools to. So there's still a lot of room for improvement, depending on what you consider to be the importance of standardized tests in the first place. But the interesting thing about this statistic for me was this. It was, if they had stayed at the main high school, the disaggregated average of the API scores of the African Americans at the main high school was 572. So they're actually doing better in the continuation high school, at least by this one small measure, even though maybe that's not even statistically significant, than they would have been doing if they were back at the main high school. And so the idea then, and that's why we're continuing with the project, we're sort of in the second year of it, we're trying to step further and further back as the researchers from a guiding role to more of a supporting role to just see where the teachers can take this. I want to just close with the principal talking a little bit about how he saw just this work in Second Life.
To experiment and learn in a new arena. It gave us a chance to move away from a lot of the standardized testing and very typical educational experiences students had. In this virtual world, students were able to use their imagination to collaborate, to build things from their imagination, which they don't normally get a chance to do. It also gave them a new language to learn and negotiate. Most impressively, the students, many of whom you'll see here, Brandon Williams, for example, is a special ed student who created things both that he needed a mathematical language as well as a technical language in order to build these things. Okoye Jones is also a special ed student who himself had to negotiate he had to use some shapes that were default shapes in Second Life and modify them in a way that would allow him to make this tunnel reach his partners across the island. So in many ways, Second Life allowed students to acquire a new language, a new literacy, a new way of thinking about learning that they don't normally get a chance to do in their traditional classrooms.
Is a panacea for all of the problems of education that we're experiencing right now. But in summary, some of the things that were important from the work that we did, that at least from my vantage point, was that teachers more and more, as they became more comfortable using various kinds of digital tools, took more and more leadership for what was possible and also to teach each other. We were really trying to create a culture, facilitate the creation of a culture that didn't depend on us being there, that was one where teachers were working together and thinking together. It was interesting. I was mentioning this to Mimi, that in my urban education class last night, there was a group book report on a book called The Teaching Gap, which compares the educational system in Japan to the educational system in the United States and Germany. They basically made the focus between the United States and Germany. And one of the things that Stigler and his collaborator talk about in terms of the United States system and why it's so hard to change is, one, it's culturally bound. But secondly, our orientation is to give people training before they get into the practice, and then to sort of leave them on their own. I mean, you have bits of programs and other kind of things that are there, to support teachers. But the idea of teachers being continual learners and having space inside of their profession to continue to develop their skills, to work with other teachers, to learn from other teachers, for me, that was one of the most important things that began to occur, that we saw the emergence of a culture of teacher leadership and teachers engaging each other. In some cases, it was motivated by just things that were going on. They would try something like, one teacher was taking more leadership than the others. She actually had an elective class in addition to her Spanish class, and she was playing with the elective class with some of these things. She called the elective class hip-hop journalism. And she was the one who started blogs first with her students, and that Worldwide Wall example came out of her class. But one of the things that they found is that when other teachers were trying to start, experiment with a blog, in some cases they were finding students coming over who already had background and experiences from this other class. And so interesting kinds of collaborations were being enabled just by the fact that it was starting in one place and the kids were bringing those skills and interests into the other class. And so then the teachers had to collaborate. They were forced to say, well, okay, like if every student has a blog in both of our classes, we can actually overload the system with so many blogs. So we need to begin to think about what is the way that the possibilities of the blog as a digital device can enable learning. And essentially what they began to decide toward the end of the year was that every kid needed to have only one blog that was petitioned for all of their classes, so that if they had different assignments going on in different classes, they almost were like having an electronic set of folders for their work that was going on in the separate classes. But at the same time, the teachers began to see that they needed to collaborate, so that in hip-hop journalism on the one hand and social studies on the other, they began to collaborate on assignments so that the students were able to sort of work simultaneously on assignments for both classes using the same digital media as a way of mediating the learning, right? So that was one of the things I think that was important. The other thing I thought that was important was comments that came out in our surveys around how these kids saw themselves excited by and interested in continuing to do research, primarily online, but just the idea that they saw themselves as researchers, that when there was a topic that was thrown out there, that they knew that there were digital resources where they could go to get information, to get ideas, to get documentation, and that they were very comfortable, doing more and more research. So this notion then that a part of what we may be thinking about in terms of the transformation of teaching and learning in schools has to do with this idea that rather than these concrete bodies of knowledge being what it is that we're trying to transmit from one generation to the other, I think we're at a place now where we're really needing to just teach our kids the kinds of skills they need to have in order to produce knowledge, to be able to make meaning in a variety of mediums and that they have, sort of the skills and the interest to learn about their world in ways that are similar, in fact, to journalists. All right, one of the things I like about the journalist metaphor is that you can have a science journalist, or you can have, a journalist for the auto industry or whatever, and that person has to decide what kinds of tools do I need to get the information that I want to learn, and then what do I want to do with that information in terms of producing it, disseminating it, moving it into other arenas. So I want to just sort of pull up there as a way of offering a few things that we've been working on to be a part of our conversation during lunch, and again, just say thank you once again for inviting me.
So I think maybe we can take a few questions before we move to discussion over lunch.
Go ahead, yes.
I thought it was very interesting what you were saying about professional development as a lifelong learning experience for teachers that was collaborative, having gone through a credentialing program and had to take those professional development classes, which are sort of the bane of your existence after you get your credential.
Right.
I was wondering what ways the work that you're doing can continue to have a life after the research project and actually be incorporated into the continual credentialing process, which is in the state of California, so that teachers can get excited as professionals truly, and not just monkeys being stuck in a room listening to something. How can you work with the state of California credentialing to really integrate this into part of the standards that they're holding teachers accountable?
Right. One, more and more, the superstructures are also providing technology standards too. So that's important that at least the language is there at many state levels and there's also a national organization with national technology standards, none of which we would disagree with in terms of, the basic spirit. I disagree with some of the writing. It's a little verbose, but beyond that, no problem. But in terms of the larger issue, and this I think goes back to how difficult it is to change the culture of teaching and learning, that every aspect of it is tied to other things that are already sort of assumed or are in place. So it might be possible to sort of work with state legislature, and I'm a member of UC Accord, which is one of the research organizations out of UCLA run by Jeannie Oakes, under the direction of Jeannie Oakes. And they really do have a systematic way of facilitating researchers learning how to talk to policymakers, right? Learning how to translate what you've done into policy briefs that may be, a paragraph or at most a page, as opposed to the ways we like to, give a context for, and all of this kind of stuff in terms of our ways of elaborating. So I think that that's important, and we're intending to do some of that, because I'm also partially vested in our own teacher education program, which we call MUSE, the Multicultural Urban Secondary Education Program at UC Berkeley. Then there are ways that we can have direct connections internally with our teachers, our pre-service teachers, and begin to encourage them to work in sites like BTech, which we're already doing. As I said before, the one teacher who talked about being technophobic started as, just finishing up our credential program, but actually selected to go to this particular school because because she had that motivation and interest. So the idea then of having people who are operating in these kinds of settings be able to, one, come back to the school and be a part of the training of other cohorts, as well as having these sort of integrated ways that a cohort has access to these kinds of sites, as opposed to only going to schools where someone has felt that they're going to get sort of the best mentoring teacher and that kind of thing. Even if you think about, as we go to structure, the notion that when you're sending a pre-service teacher out, you're sending them to a mentoring teacher, right? So the only multiplication of the teaching relationship or the learning relationship is by a factor of 1. as opposed to going into a community of teachers who are bringing newer people into this community of how we, work with each other to continue to develop our practice as a lifelong, group of learners, right? So those are the kinds of structural constraints that when they don't exist, then when our teachers who've been, even when they've had the training and have more of a collaborative orientation, when they get into practice, and this is what Stigler is basically making a case about in the teaching gap, they usually fall back to the default mode, right, of what the structures are honoring and rewarding, or in some cases demanding, as opposed to being, and especially as new teachers, they're not the ones who are able to change that system so much as try to figure out how can I fit in addition to the fact that they're struggling with all of these other kinds of things. So we have to have a different way of thinking about teacher professional development to begin with, right? Because the notion that we can have a standalone program and then somehow these people are now ready to come into practice and implement all of these things that they've learned, as opposed to being in a setting where the learning and the teaching are going on simultaneously, where you're in in other words, I think one of the possible strengths of changes that are occurring is that we do have more districts taking responsibility for teacher training rather than leaving it to the universities, all right? So there's a little bit of a struggle going on between universities because it's a turf war, right? Who has the right to these new teachers? But if more of the training moves to the district level, and then districts can develop this culture of more extensive learning going on rather than it being training, but that I think the Japanese model is very interesting in this regard because their whole orientation with this notion of lesson study is that teachers come together and they pose a problem, right? That is, a problem that their current lessons are not addressing that well. And then they collaborate on how they're going to address that problem. They develop, a new design, and someone actually demonstrates or models the teaching of that, and all the other teachers come into the classroom, and they're watching that happen. And then they step back again and have conversations about what went well and what didn't, and then another teacher steps forward, somewhere later, maybe a week or so later, and demonstrates the same lesson. In other words, it's just like they feel like change is going to be gradual. It needs to be continual, but it's often gradual. And then then when they get it more or less perfected, in other words, solving the problem that they originally posed, then they start disseminating it and arguing for this way of doing it, right? But that's a very different culture from what's going on in the United States, right?
So are you working with any district intern programs? Because what you just described is the way the Unified School District intern program does work.
I'm only working with ours at UC Berkeley, which is, it's a pre-service credentialing program. It's also a master's degree program, but we do supervise the students in their teacher practice sites, and we also have another year of an engagement with that same cohort after they leave, so that there's another year of meetings that they have, back with us. But I'm saying this research we just did, it literally finished in June of 2008, this year. So the opportunity to start thinking about some of the dissemination possibilities, it's there, but we haven't really realized a lot of what. But these are good. These are great ideas, though, that you're giving us. Yes.
But there was an interesting slide in there on the second life piece, where it said, advantages, easy entry point, but potential for more programming skills and stuff. And then it had a little sort of potential problems was it was something around developing identity through purchasing objects in the game and so on. So I guess I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about maybe the tensions and resolutions you found around bringing commercial spaces, as many of the most popular online new media spaces are commercial spaces, into the classroom, while some of them have non-commercial alternatives that exist that you could use. How does that sort of play out in the classroom? Is that discussed? Is it sort of critically reflected? Let's just use these tools because they're
sort of meta discussion of even the viability and value of the tool beyond learning skills for actually using the tool. We had those discussions in teacher professional development, all right? but again, I think that these are the kind of discussions I would love to see us have take place in our second year, because people were so, in some ways, overwhelmed by just learning. I mean, if you look at all the things, I mean, I didn't even mention all the things. We did Comic Life and, you know, all of these kinds of storyboarding, you know, kinds of digital mediums that are available too. So that the first part was just to have this potpourri, right, of choices, and then to see what teachers began to do. And I think it's going to take us another year, this academic year, which is, you know, we're sort of deep into already, to really get a sense of what things have been useful and viable and why. That's your question. You know, in other words, not just being slaves to the technology and here's something and let's do something. The kids are excited about it, so it must be working, right? See, it brings us to the other element, which, you know, we haven't even begun to address, which is assessment. You know, how do we know that a student's podcast is a high-quality podcast? Versus, you know, so how do we assign, if we're going to stay with grades, an A to this one and a B to that one? What's the criteria, you know, that, and so none of our traditional assessment methods allow us to think deeply about that, because we're dealing with monotextual assessment, you know, conceptual frames, and multitextual, you know, semiotic domain-driven, you know, multimodal kinds of digital media that, you know, I mean, there's some work, you know, some work that's already, you know, coming out that's helping us think about it. But certainly, you know, the simple overlay of a template of assessment coming from our background and experiences as educators is completely inappropriate for really understanding what's going on. So a part of that notion of the assessment, I think, would take into account your consideration that you're not just assessing what we did with it and what we learned by it, but we're also assessing the viability and value of this as an entity in the classroom in the first place. You know, in other words, challenging each tool for, you know, its utility and not just accepting it. So again, we're not there yet. Yes.
I'm going to make my question the last one so we can go to lunch. But so it's kind of related to Sasha's question, but I was curious, you know, how much the experiences you were giving these kids in school differed from what they had access to outside of school, and to what extent, you know, that it's sort of that question that you open the talk with, is that kids are have their mobile phones and they have their, you know, text, and they're doing all these things with regular commercial popular culture. And what is it that you're trying to reconfigure in that relationship, and how different is it from what you're already doing?
Yeah. They're engaging in all of these experiences, and I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, as your work has shown, also the social networking possibilities. Some identity issues are tied up in that, but also desire and pleasure, that people are really just experiencing pleasure. They're not just going to some of these games or these other kind of things so that they can learn something, right? And I think that the role of the educator is to continually be figuring out what are the learning possibilities, and how does the medium get reconfigured in the context of a learning environment, so that you know, things beyond just skill with operating the medium, you know, is developed, and, you know, there's some sense of where you're going with it, that there's a roadmap, you know, for, you know, you're not just learning how to drive a car, but there's the purpose in learning to drive it is to be able to, you know, go from point A to point B. And I think that young people, and this is why the disciplinary knowledge becomes important, even though the disciplinary knowledge has to shift and be more multidisciplinary at the same time. But I think that the teachers, the educators have to be able to see what some of the meaning-making and learning extensions of these activities are. So the heart of your question was, how is this different from what's going on in sort of youth organizations? I think that part of what I would like to see is more of, you know, more similarities between what's going on in effective youth organizations who are working with digital media and what's going on in school. In other words, one of the reasons they're successful is that the kids are enticed by the fact that what they're learning has real-world applications. so that when they're, maybe doing a podcast, they see that that production occurring in a medium, or potentially occurring in a medium, or at the very least it's up on a website. In other words, it's not just going through the motions of learning as we often do in school, and then the products of that learning are never seen again, even by the student. Now, that portfolio stays with the teacher and we move on. But learning to have an impact on our environment in one way or another. And I think that that's what some of the youth organizations are focusing on. And to the extent that schools can at least take kids partly in that direction also, both for the relevance of it, so that rather than, us trying to think about it differently, I think the first thing is like, can we do some of the same things? And then we can also say, well, then the school context is ultimately different. So what do the differences need to be? But we haven't quite worked that out. It's a great question. I'm going to be thinking about that on the plane home.